Lives and livelihoods have been disrupted by COVID-19. From the CEO in the boardroom, the teacher in the classroom, the cook in the canteen, the clerk in the courtroom, or the cashier at the boutique, the impact on unemployment has been deep, far-reaching, and unprecedented. This pandemic is not only impacting the quantity of jobs, but also the quality of jobs. In addition to expected income losses, there's concern that poverty will worsen with increased numbers of working poor. Only last week, we learned that the National Insurance Scheme last year spent over $176 million on unemployment and severance claim, a whopping $155 million covered NIS claims alone, compared to $49 million the year before, $38 million in 2018, and $32 million in 2017. Minister of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs Cynthia Ford has also told us of an exceptional increase in the number of families approaching the welfare department to secure at least $600 a month through the Household Survival Program in 2021 when compared with last year. In fact, the fund, which was originally intended to serve 1,500 vulnerable households, is now propping up over 6,000. The tourism sector has been particularly hard hit, with scores of attractions obviously closed and occupancy levels in most hotels hovering somewhere between 0 and 20%. For employers in the sector, the saddening situation is merely a continuation of the circumstances that led to the temporary closure of hotels last year, which were followed by a number of seemingly spontaneous protests that provided interesting insight on how some hospitality workers really feel about the value of their labor in the all-important sector. Ultimately, we understand the indelible link between the resilience of businesses and the survival of thousands of people who only by the sweat of their brow are able to eat. So how do we move forward in this new normal? Here to delve into the issues with me is a panel of experts with a bird's eye view on Barbados' labor environment. Minister of Labor and Social Partnership Relations, Colin Jordan, General Secretary of the Barbados Workers Union, Tony Moore, Executive Director of the Barbados Employers Confederation, Ms. Sheena Mears-Granville, Chairman of the Barbados Hotel and Tourism Association, Jeffrey Roach, and Paula Walcott, Assistant Vice President of Human Resources at Sagicor General Insurance, Inc. The discussion starts right after the break.
Advertise with us in COVID Weekly. For more information, email us at sales@barbadostoday.bb or contact us at 234-0046 or 234-1201 or 234-1210.
We are back to discuss the state of labor and employment relations in Barbados. Let's get right into the discussion with Labor Minister Colin Jordan. Now, over the last few days, we've gotten updated insight into the current state of workers and working class households, but one of the things we haven't heard is the current unemployment figures. Minister, what are the latest on the figures? Can you explain the methodology used by the Labor Department for arriving at those numbers?
Thank you very much, Kareem, and good afternoon to fellow panelists. Good afternoon to listeners and viewers. The latest information that I received from the ministry responsible for the Barbados Statistical Service, which is the Economic Affairs Division of the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, is an unemployment rate of 17.9%. Now, in terms of the methodology used, note that we take this information from the ministry. The Barbados Statistical Service conducts surveys and they come up with the number, and we use the numbers that we get from them. But it is somewhere in the region of between 17 and 18% at last count. a high number. We understand the situation, but we also recognize that this is not just a number. This represents people who, many of whom are accustomed to earning, who are not now earning. So that is the latest number latest figure that we have.
Okay. Do you have any insight though as to how the ministry arrives at those figures? Does it include, I mean, we would have just seen a total lockdown. Does it include those persons who would have been affected by the lockdown? And when were those statistics actually tallied?
The numbers I have, I think, may have been at third quarter of 2020. So before we got into fourth quarter, we were still coming out of the lockdown of 2020. Now, the unemployment figures are figures as at a point in time. So it is not to say that persons will have been unemployed 2 weeks, a month after that snapshot was given. It is always at a point in time, and persons who have jobs but are temporarily laid off would not be considered unemployed, but persons who are unemployed long-term would definitely be considered. I am not an authority on the methodology used, so I'm not going to go very much further, lest I err and be chastised later for it, because I know sometimes the media is not very forgiving. So just let me say that I'm not fully aware of all of the dynamics that goes into the calculation of it. The statisticians do that, and they share the numbers with us.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. I want to bring in Ms. Mears Granville at this time to just get an idea of the employer's perspective on these numbers, whether the BEC has been tracking the unemployment figures, and whether you're satisfied that this is an accurate representation of the reality on the ground.
Well, good evening, everyone. I will not dispute the figures produced by the Statistical Service. I know those figures come through the household survey. So there is a methodology to how the Statistical Service will gather the data and report on the unemployment statistics. But what I can add to the discussion would be there are certain areas that may not be captured when we look at our unemployment statistics. For example, usually when you're looking at unemployment figures, you look at those persons who are not working and actively looking for jobs. So we may have a portion of persons in Barbados who they are no longer in the labor market, they're not working. But given the current circumstances, they've resigned themselves to not looking for work currently. So they may have opted, well, they might have been willing to work up until 65 or 67. We have persons who may be in their early 60s who said, you know, given the current state of the economy and the labor market, I'm not going to find a job. So those persons would have removed themselves earlier than intended from the labor market. And another factor we would have to consider would be underemployment. The reality is the current economic circumstance has resulted in persons who might have traditionally worked a 40-hour week, where that was never a concern for them. They've now been on reduced hours. So they might be working 3 days a week. And of course, they're not unemployed, but the earning income has been affected for those persons. So those are just 2 points I want to add when we look at the unemployment statistics.
Okay, well, I mean, if we want to get an accurate representation of what's happening on the ground, in your opinion, is there any way of being able to include these statistics into the numbers?
I will leave that for the statisticians and how they choose to report, because we have to be careful. Reports then are compared across countries, and statistics are used to compare what's happening in one country versus another. So you don't just change the formula or the methodology for calculating your statistics. But I just wanted to highlight, you know, those are features as well that we have to consider.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's take it to tourism and the BHGA chair, Mr. Roach. We know that the Barbados Employment and Sustainability Program is still under review, and some tourism players will determine eventually when they want to get on board to keep workers employed. But as of now, what kind of unemployment numbers are we looking at in the sector? Mr. Roach, you're gonna have to unmute your mic. Sorry.
My apologies. I was trying to avoid any feedback. So good evening, Kareem. Good evening, fellow panelists, and good evening to all the listeners. When we look at tourism, in terms of the unemployment, if I take a step back and go back to last year, when we were first impacted by COVID-19, if we look at the tourism sector, it is estimated that approximately 16 to 17,000 people are employed directly in tourism, and with a further approximately 45,000 in total, or thereabout, being employed in indirect tourism. When we were first impacted, tourism was certainly impacted severely, and the numbers that we were hearing about or were reporting was that of the direct employment, somewhere in the region of about 10,000 people were actually laid off. So we're talking about approximately 62 or so % of the persons actively involved in direct tourism services having been laid off as a result of COVID. As Minister Jordan said, late last year, we started to see some resurgence in traffic into Barbados, at least for long stay. And with that, we then saw that some persons were brought back up to the workforce. But subsequently, with the lockdown in the UK, as well as the lockdown in Canada, those numbers have fallen off. So where we were starting to see occupancies in the hotel sector of 40% in some cases and up to 50% in some cases, those occupancies have actually declined to less than 10% at this point. So that would mean that certainly some of those persons who had been brought back out to work are in some cases now back off from work. The BEST program, it was recognized by ourselves and as well as by government that given the circumstances that the BEST program needed to be relooked and had some tweaks made. So we've actually sat and gone through those with government, and those refinements to the program are now with the government for final sign-off. It is our anticipation that given some of the queries that some of our members would have had and would have raised regarding the program, that with some of the changes, and I wouldn't want to go into the changes until they are approved by government, but with some of the changes that have been mooted, we are hopeful that more of our members will actually sign on to the program because what that means is that there's financial support for them to continue keeping their businesses afloat, and also to bring some of their team members back out. Because one of the things certainly for a lot of the players is that, you spent many years building a capable workforce, and you don't want to lose some of those persons because tourism will rebound. You don't want the industry to rebound and you not have that skilled labor force that in some cases, some persons have been with organizations for 30 plus years. So, you have specialized people that you want to retain. We're hopeful that approval should be signed off on soon, and we'll see numbers increasing. But at the last count, for those persons who had applied to the program, I believe that the number of persons who were actively engaged under the BEST program, and I say under the program because there are a lot of tourism players who have kept their persons on payroll despite the fact that they're making losses. But you can only sustain that for so long. But at last count, those persons who were actively engaged under the BEST program was in the region of just under 17,000 employees.
Okay. And when was that count?
I believe that would have been about maybe 3 weeks ago or so.
3 weeks ago or so. Okay. Thank you for the update. Moving on nicely to the Barbados Workers Union's General Secretary for her opening remarks. Ms. Moore, just to find out, are you satisfied that the numbers represented by the Labour Minister, by the BHDA, are a true representation of the situation on the ground? Are there any specific groups that are in particularly dire situations? I know from time to time we've been hearing some people argue that women, single mothers, for example, are particularly vulnerable at this time. What's your perspective?
Thank you, Kareem, and good evening, fellow panelists. The numbers that have been presented, do they adequately reflect the situation in Barbados? I would say not necessarily. It's just that our system provides for some considerable lag, because Minister was referring to figures from third quarter. When we heard the governor of the central bank earlier this year in January, he spoke about unemployment figures being in the region of 18.5, and the likelihood that those figures would go up, contingent on a lockdown and how long the lockdown was. Then we heard from the national insurance, from which the central bank gets its figures, that for the first 6 weeks or so in the year, unemployment figures were in the region of about 15,000 or so, and that's the unofficial statistics. Now, how that relates to unemployment, whether it's just people, as you heard the director of the BEC speaking about, whether it's people that will be just in short-term layoff versus longer periods of layoff that will lend into the unemployment figure, that is something that the statisticians work out, and that is responsible for the lag. So the truest picture that you get in terms of actual figures recorded tend to reflect some lag of 3 months or so. So I know that your question and your curiosity in pursuing the question with the minister and then going to the BEC and then coming to me, it's because you would be concerned that figures may have increased somewhat, and that the figures that you're hearing will seem modest, and there's a reason for that I alluded to. As it relates to the particular groups that have been impacted, you're correct. Women remain highly impacted, and young people. Whenever there's a situation that leads or requires layoff in any form or fashion, we tend to see younger people, those who have just entered the labor market. They tend to be the ones bearing the brunt of the layoff or the first point of impact. As it relates to the hospitality sector, which we've heard so much about, the statistics would reflect highly on females, because a large part of hospitality, tourism, restaurants, and hotels, in particular, a lot of those figures would relate to women. And you may have heard me mention earlier, some months ago, that women have faced another impact, even with work from home situations, because women tend to be caregivers who are working remotely and having responsibility for overseeing children who are in online learning. But if we go back to sectors and not just categories of workers, in terms of the gender perspective, who have been directly impacted, we've spoken a lot of tourism, but there are a number of linkage industries that relate to tourism. And one such area that has been heavily impacted is retail. And for the year so far, unemployment figures and the number of claims that have been submitted before the National Insurance Board, it is more heavily impacting retail. In fact, the area of highest direct impact has been in retail. And a partial reason for that could be the very fact that you've heard Jeffrey mention the fact that a number of hotels, for instance, brought back out staff toward the end of last quarter in 2020, and some of them may have gone back off. So smaller numbers may be reflected there. But retail in this particular period of lockdown has been the area that has the most heavily hit. And I'm saying that because normally when national insurance reports its statistics, it separates out hotels from restaurants, bars, and canteens. Combined, it would be heaviest, but the single area will be retail that has me hard to say.
The update. I want to move on now to Ms. Paula Walcott, Assistant Vice President, Human Resources at Sagicor General Insurance, Inc. Ms. Walcott, Sagicor is one of the most significant conglomerates represented in the country. What has been the position of Sagicor as we navigate all of these moving parts, businesses recording low returns? What has been Sagicor's position in all of this?
Thank you, Kareem. Good evening to our panelists and good evening to the viewers. The reality is the uncertainty that COVID-19 has brought is difficult for any business to navigate. But we've been very sure at Sagicor that we were going to be very people-centric in our approach. So everything we have done has been towards prioritizing the safety of our employees. That includes their mental health. And one of the things that has impacted many persons is the uncertainty around jobs. So very early on, our employees were given an assurance that there would be no immediate cuts related to COVID-19. What we've drawn heavily on throughout this process has also been our culture. And we started building our culture way before COVID-19 came. And the efforts and we've been able to enable our leaders to prioritize people. And that has really done us well. We've been able to forge those relationships. A lot of times we talk about employment relationships, but we don't realize that the relationship takes work. And our culture, our people have been amazing. We've been able to really collaborate, stay connected. As much as about 74% of our employees have stayed remote even when we were open. The fact is, we were more connected out of the process of everything we've done prior. We've taken a very holistic approach with regards to the protocols. We actually took the protocols a step further and we had guidelines that we put in place. So there was a lot of certainty for our people. So while uncertainty would come because they're impacted based on what's going on in their family and so on, as far as Sagicor was concerned, we tried to minimize the uncertainty. So our people knew for sure up front, if a member of your family has traveled and they're returning, when you are at home quarantining, we are going to continue to pay you. Similarly, now where testing is something that is present for us, they know that when they are awaiting the results of a test, they don't have to feel pressure to come to work. They're not going to lose any pay. So that has been very important for us in this process, and it has served us well.
So much, Mrs. Walcott. At this time, we'll take a break and we get back to our discussion on labor relations in Barbados when we get back. And we are back with our discussion on labor relations in Barbados. I want to continue our discussion right where we left off. I want to bring back in Mrs. Moore. We spoke about the fact that the unemployment figures that we're seeing may not necessarily be a true representation of what's going on at this point. But I know this is a question that the union gets from time to time. How has this uncertainty impacted union membership? What are the numbers starting to look like for the union, given the dislocation that we've seen in terms of employment?
Well, in the throes of 2020, when we were looking at unemployment, we were hearing that tourism accounted for some 40% of the unemployment claims. And if we consider that tourism is a major contributor to our GDP, and in every report that the governor has mentioned, we've seen how tourism has impacted the economy as a whole, then no one should be under any impression that the union has been spared in its impact. In fact, tourism workers accounted for about 15% of our overall membership, and that is significant. So where we have seen, as we saw last year, that tourism figures had been hit so severely in employment, in terms of unemployment, that is, one naturally concludes, as has been our reality, that it has had a direct impact at the union. So, but while we have experienced that, we have also experienced areas of increase and not decline. And those areas tend to be in a number of the essential areas where workers recognize the need for protection. We have had interest from new areas, including those in entertainment, some in entertainment and so on. So while not in large enough numbers to compensate for the decline that would be experienced in the area of tourism, and specifically hotels have been one of our strongest divisions for most of the 80 years that the Barbados Workers Union has existed. The reality is that the decline that has been observed is not so significant to cause us any undue worry at this time.
As to how the union is going to continue, you've said it, to continue that legacy of 80 years of representation for Barbados's business class, because I mean, the COVID crisis isn't going anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, if the union behaves unlike every other business that has had to regroup and check itself, then we will have to worry about the question that you've asked. But every other company out there, every other business entity, even the church, has had to reconsider its approach to the way that it does things. And the union is no different. So as I said, we have received interest and membership intake from new areas. And the union is constantly looking at new ways in which that it could reach out to members and reach out to people. And one of the things that you are going to be seeing from us and come May Day is our refocus on essential workers, yes, and refocus on the whole issue of occupational safety and health, and a total refocus on conditions of work. One of the things, and I believe you would want to hear a bit more of this coming closer to May Day, that we will be looking at is, productivity, bonuses, and so on. When we experienced the crisis of 1991, that is the direction in which we tended. And the union since then has been struggling to get employers to engage on that subject. And we see this as an important time that we can reestablish a labor protection floor that focuses on better hours of work, minimum wages, fundamental rights, and occupational safety and health. So I leave that for you to come back to me later.
Understood. Thank you so much for that. Ms. Mears Granville, of course, labor is one side, but the employers are on the other end of the spectrum, and they are struggling as well. What impact is that having at the level of the BEC in terms of memberships and their contributions and their engagement?
So I can say that the BEC's experience, it's similar to what was shared by Ms. Moore. So what we have seen, as some persons do recognize that the BC is a membership organization, even though we do service both members and non-members. But in terms of our membership, we have noticed from 2021, the start of this year, a decline in terms of the number of employees employed by our members. So membership at the BEC has increased, to be honest. However, where our members might have employed, for example, 100 persons, they've reported to us their employee count may now be 80. So that is a trend that we have seen, especially for 2021, as persons have had to adapt to the changing circumstance. but we have seen some growth in terms of membership numbers. And I think this is because throughout 2020, we were able to share a lot of information and technical assistance with members and non-members in terms of how they can navigate the changing landscape. And persons have reached out to us so that they can be assisted through that. And they realize we do have a wealth of resources to assist them. But similar to what Tony would have shared, every business in Barbados has been forced to look at their operations. They've been forced to look at flexibility in the workplace, to look at reducing staff, to look at how can they do things better. And we have had to do the same thing as well. I don't think any economic or even civic organization has been spared that. I think this pandemic is a defining moment in how we do business. And I don't want to use that cliche phrase about build back better, but we do have to look at how we operate and look to pull best practices from wherever and see how we can have our companies on a more productive streak and better positioned that when we have contained the crisis and when the world starts on a path to recovery, that we are ready to take off, to launch, and to reap those benefits.
Understood. Oh, thank you, Minister Jordan. I just want you to weigh in here. You've heard the perspective of our unions and our workers, and you've heard the perspective of the Employers Confederation. Based on what you've heard, does it augur well for the future of the social partnership and that balance between labor and capital? And what role do you intend to play in ensuring that continues to stay intact in this environment?
The social partnership, Kareem and viewers, was forged in a period of significant economic stress. And I say forged to include not just built, but forged to speak to the result of a process that has gone through much stress, much heat. And so the matter of the social partnership and its strength, this pandemic period has suggested to me and to government that the social partnership remains strong. And as a matter of fact, I think we kind of give, we give an understanding to the country about our view of the social partnership from our very first working day. We were sworn into office as ministers, members of the cabinet, on a Sunday. And our first meeting was the following morning at 10 with the members of the social partnership. That was to say to the social partners and to the country that we understood that their role was going to be critical in rebuilding the country. The current pandemic is also a significant challenge, a more significant challenge than the challenge we faced when we came into office, a more significant challenge than the crisis of the 1991, 92, 93 period. But it is a challenge that the social partnership, from its formation and up to and including our approach to engaging with the social partnership, that structure is one that has already helped us maneuver in this really challenging period of not just our history, but the world's history. So the social partnership remains strong. Government continues to engage with the partners, employers, as well as workers and their organizations, or workers through their organizations. We continue to engage with them. The discussions are often robust, and that is what a good partnership is built of. And so I have no doubt whatsoever that the social partnership will continue to be that mechanism that allows us to sit around the table as government, as workers' organizations, as employers, and we've also brought in members of civil society, the third sector, into many of the conversations, that construct, that structure will allow us to navigate these challenging times. And so we've remained open to the partners. So we've been having meetings with employers, we've had meetings with the workers unions, and kept everybody up to date. We've attempted to respond to questions and to challenges. That will continue, and the ministry responsible for that, along with the Prime Minister's office, the Prime Minister is the chair of the social partnership, will continue to engage with our partners to make sure that we come out of this period stronger than when we went into this pandemic period.
Thank you, Minister. At this time, we'll take a break, and when we get back, we're going to start to talk about what the new employment landscape is going to look like as we move through this COVID-19 crisis and hopefully at some point out of this COVID-19 crisis. Stay tuned. So we're back with our discussion on labor relations in Barbados. I want to start with Ms. Mears Granville because we're going to get into some discussion about the future of business in Barbados, what it's going to look like. And one of the points recently highlighted by the Chamber of Commerce is that the most innovative, progressive, and resilient workers are most likely to keep their jobs. And perhaps that is kind of obvious. But what exactly does that mean? When the pandemic first struck, we kept hearing people talk about some sort of new digital revolution where more businesses would offer their services online, more people would work remotely, and essentially that the workplace would never be the same. What has become of that discussion?
Well, I will share that the nature of work has been transforming for the past few years. It might have been slower in Barbados, but we saw a change in working arrangements happening internationally, and the ILO would have even done a study on it. So we know that the nature of work has been changing. What happened though is in 2020, by March 2020, businesses were dry kicking and screaming. That's my analogy. So into that new sphere. So while you would have attempted to make the change gradually, all of a sudden it had to be done instantaneously in order to continue operations. What that has meant though is we've had a few months where persons have had the opportunity to fine tune their systems and to look at how do we make work more attractive, because we want to attract and maintain the best talent, because that is how my business is going to thrive. How do we build more resilience into our working arrangements? So prior to last year, we never had to deal with a pandemic situation. So how do I look at making sure that my business can operate through whatever may come? And what we found then is persons are starting to incorporate those practices into their regular business. And I hope that this is a trend that will continue. So when we look at work from home arrangements, for example, yes, there are some businesses that once lockdown is lifted, they want persons to return to the workplace. But then there are some who will say, you know what, I'm going to create some redundancy in my system and I'm going to make work from home a feature of my employment arrangement. It doesn't have to be completely work from home. It could be partial. Persons might work from home for 2 days in a week or etc. or if they're working on a project, but it becomes part of their regular working arrangements. So those are some of the things that we see happening in the business community. And Minister Jordan and Mr. Moore, as part of the social partnership, would have known that back in, I think it was 2019, the social partnership had a subcommittee looking at the structure of work, recognizing that these changes were something coming on board so that we could start to take a look at how the structure of work could be revisited in Barbados. Unfortunately, we've had a little pause on our work as everyone has had to respond to the pandemic, but it is something that is in the mind of the social partnership, and it's something that all parties are part of that discussion, and hopefully that will resume soon.
Understood. Thank you. I think this is a great section where we could bring in Mrs. Moore, because we've been hearing that along with these changing working conditions have been arbitrary, in some cases, changes to the employment contracts. And what does this mean for workers, this whole changing landscape? Is it a situation where Barbadian workers, many of them, are going to be left behind? You have to unmute your mic, please.
That's an interesting question. The view of the Barbados Workers Union is similar to the view of unions around the world. And it's a conversation that we were having recently, that what COVID-19 has shown is that now more than ever, workers need their union. In 2020, when we had what we could term the onset of the COVID-19 impact here, I think that what you spoke of and what you identified as an issue with a number of arbitrary arrangements being put in place was something that we experience more fully than we are observing now. What we did coming out of that experience, we started meetings with the Ministry of Labor through the Labor Department as well, to make sure that we can streamline some things, because one of the things the Barbados Workers Union had been insisting is that a crisis is not a time for us to lose sense and sensibility. And we had laws in place to address some of the aspects of the crisis that we were treating to. We have the Employment Rights Act, for instance, that spoke about consultations, but where consultations can take place, the process that should be engaged, which was not a process as we saw being used by some employers, where you simply say, I can't do this, and you submit a letter to the Ministry of Labor, to the Labor Department, and then the next day you continue along the course that you think you should pursue. So we've been able to iron out a number of those, and I think that what will be required in the future of work, and even as we navigate the coming months, would be for workers to stick closely to their union, because the collective bargaining process, which allows for social dialogue with the union and the employer, is what is going to make the difference to a lot of workers out there. And that's not only for the divisions that we are involved in, but at the level of the social partnership, the input from the union is going to be highly critical.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Roach, this new workplace that we're talking about, in my view, might mean something completely different, or in some ways might be quite different for the tourism and hotel sector. Our Minister of Tourism, Senator Lisa Cummins, just last week told me about some ambitious plans to have a tourism resurgence coming on to the end of the year. But first is the safety of all the workers at the airport, the seaport, and more importantly, in the hotels, restaurants, bars, and attractions, many of which are owned and run by the BHTA. How are your members envisioning a restart of the tourism sector that emphasizes the safety of the over 35,000 workers in the sector, and also emphasizes the strict adherence to whatever protocols are put in place?
Thanks, Kareem. Yeah, definitely safety is a critical point for us going forward, because unlike some other industries, tourism is the people industry. So it's about persons providing experiences for persons who will visit Barbados. So unlike another area where you can work from home, we can't do that from home. You know, we have to be hands-on. And what I will say is that I've listened in on a number of webinars on research that has been conducted in the area of tourism. And what has been one common thread that has come through is that persons who want to travel, their number one concern going forward, given the advent of COVID, is safety. So for us, we've at every opportunity worked with the relevant authorities here to discuss and make input into the protocols. We've continued to encourage our members to adhere to the protocols and ensure the staff are trained in the protocols to ensure that their staff, first of all, are safe. And then two, for persons who choose to come to Barbados, either now or in the future, that they feel a sense of safety when they're here, because I think that's one of the critical things in rebuilding traveler confidence, that people feel safe about the destination that they're traveling to. So for us, it will always be hands-on, and we have to bear that in mind. But one of the things that I think is relevant here, and General Secretary or Assistant Tony spoke about it, was the collaboration. Now, when I posted this discussion on my IG page, and I hashtag it Barbados Together, because the truth is that that's the only way that we are going to come out of this in a meaningful way. There has to be constant dialogue and collaboration. So even within the BHTA, among our members, we have found that because we needed to discuss and collaborate on some of the issues as an association, I would say that there has been a level of collaboration and cooperation within the association that has probably been stronger than it has ever been in the past. With the Workers' Union, we have had a number of meetings with the Workers' Union to discuss issues. And the truth is that, while as Tony said, there are regulations that you need to adhere to, everyone doesn't get it right all the time. But we rely on the BWU as one of the control mechanisms in the process to flag for us when there are issues that need to be addressed. So what we've been able to do successfully is to identify where there have been issues, and through dialogue with those members, rectify, even if not all, but the majority of those situations that have arisen. Okay. So that's going to be very critical going forward, that level of collaboration across agencies.
I want to, and I appreciate that explanation, but I really want to touch on this issue in a bit more of a practical sense, because when we talk tourism, we're talking bartenders, we're talking room service, we're talking pools and pool attendants. Are there any discussions at that practical level taking place right now as to how these persons are going to be kept safe when we restart tourism? Even last year, when we had situations with persons attempting to breach quarantine, all of these, in my mind at least, raise red flags when it comes to the safety of our tourism workers. So have the discussions reached that point as yet?
Yeah, yes, they have actually. There's a full suite of protocols for every operation under the tourism umbrella. So whether it be room attendants or bartenders, or as you said, pool attendants, there's a full suite of protocols that have been discussed and agreed, and all of the members have been provided with that information. And I know that a lot of the, if not all of the entities have actually undertaken training with their staff to ensure that the staff are versed and aware of the protocols and adhere to them.
Perspective, who should be tasked, or to what extent rather, does the management of hotels have a duty to ensure that these protocols are enforced? Because I know we hear a lot about the COVID-19 monitoring unit, but we also know that they cannot be there 24/7. To what extent, in your view, does management have a role to play here?
Oh, management has a very critical role, because at the end of the day, your staff remaining safe is key to your property, and I'm speaking about hotels in this case, but it extends as well to all the members, whether you're being an attraction or a restaurant, so you're being able to remain open and operate. Because if you're not adhering to protocols, and there should be an unfortunate incident of COVID at your property, then it's like a red mark against you, and you certainly don't want that. So I think the onus on management is critical to ensure that the protocols are known and adhered to.
Understood. I want to bring in Ms. Mears Granville as well. Even though the BEC is not limited to tourism, tourism, of course, makes up a large number of our employers across Barbados. How do you view the restart to tourism in terms of safety, not just for the tourists, but especially for those workers?
So there are two things I want to highlight, Kareem. I want to talk about dialogue and I'll talk about safety, because just a bit earlier, we were talking about social partnership and dialogue. And I think it's important for our persons to understand that we do engage in effective dialogue in Barbados. It doesn't mean that everyone will get what they want out of the process, but we do engage a lot. And I think from where I sit, I have seen a difference between 2020 lockdown and 2021 lockdown in terms of the engagement between the parties. And I think this is because 2020, it was almost a shock to the system and persons were trying to figure out what to do. I do agree with Tony that just because you're in crisis doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want to do. But persons were struggling with a new paradigm and in responding very, very quickly. Because when the time frame between knowing that we're going on lockdown and lockdown being affected and being able to deal with that process was very limited and it was very new for a lot of persons. What I can say is over the intervening months, we've had a lot more dialogue. There's more information out there for persons, or information is presented in a way that makes it easier to understand. And therefore, when we approached this national pause at the start of February, I saw a difference in terms of how we engaged with how employers and employees engaged with each other ahead of that process. But also in terms of safety now, one of the things that I observe from where I sit is businesses want their employees to be safe. Businesses want their employees to be safe because what that means is my business can remain open. These employees who have been with me for a while, they can continue to earn an income. And what we saw was businesses implementing the protocols as outlined. So taking it outside of tourism, we know that when you go into a store in Sheraton, if you went from one store to another, you were being scanned for your temperature, you were contact tracing information was being taken, sanitization stations, and just to go from one store to another, you had to go through the entire routine. So businesses have been promoting safety among their workers. And this is my anecdotal evidence. I can't say that statistically this is proven, but what we did not see was a lot of transmission within workplaces. COVID-19 does not seem to be spreading within workplaces in Barbados. I'm not saying it does not happen at all, but what we tend to see is there's a one case at a business and then there's a response, but not the trend has not been to see entire departments or an entire business. So in terms of safety, our employers have been employing the protocols to make sure that their workers are safe. As Jeffrey would have highlighted, no business wants to be labeled as a place where COVID is spreading. So they have been doing their utmost to make sure that the protocols are followed and that the employees are kept safe.
Okay. And I think it's very interesting that our Minister of Labor has spent quite a number of years in the tourism sector. What is your perspective? What will the Minister be looking for from tourism employers as we move towards a restart in tourism?
I'm going to answer you, Kareem, but I want to touch on a couple of things first. One has to do with the matter of dialogue that Sheila spoke to. There has been a lot of dialogue, but I need to say to you, and I need to say to the Barbadian public, that I have seen, and government has seen, a lot of learning taking place. Now that is important because we went into a pandemic, as Sheena just said, and everybody knows, uncharted waters. Many of us didn't know what to do. I sometimes am a slightly lighthearted to say the only person I know who was around in the Spanish flu period was Mr. Mel Williams, who was one of my constituents. He is 111 years old. But we did not know fully what was facing us. And so there were lots of strange reactions in some cases. What we have seen is a level of learning, and that supports what Sheena just said. The second time around, many of the issues that we had previously did not present themselves in as significant a way as they did in 2020. So Tony, for example, spoke to the matter of consultation when you don't have the 6 weeks that the Employment Rights Act speaks to in terms of determining if you're going to lay off and how you're going to go about that process. Now, we dealt with that as a government frontally with the employers and with the support of the union to enforce the law, because as far as we're concerned, the laws remain on the books, they remain in force, and a pandemic is not a time to move away from that. So we indicated what the law was, and we insisted that even though we could not have 6 weeks to make some adjustments, that we had to follow the law, which says that you have to inform and consult with the chief labor officer. And you have to do, you, the employer, as much as is possible in the consultative process. So you don't have 6 weeks, you may have 6 days, but we have to go through the process. The workers' representatives, the union must be notified. You must indicate that, or give some substantiation for layoff being the final and the only option. And then we have to speak to how do you determine who's going to be laid off and who's going to remain. So the matter of those issues that were much larger in 2020, there's been quite a bit of learning, and on the part of employers, also on the part of workers and their representatives, and we've seen some progress. Now, on the matter of safety and health and safety in the workplace, the social partnership coined what is still for us a guiding principle: safe people doing safe work in a safe country, so that whatever we are doing is people focused, people centered, because workers are not machines. They're not pieces of equipment. They're not crops. Workers are human beings. And so their welfare has to be high up on the agenda. All of that while recognizing that businesses also are entities that have certain abilities, certain restrictions. And in the area of safety and health, we have placed quite a lot of emphasis on that. During the lockdowns, the safety and health section of the Ministry of Labor of the Labor Department has been active, inspecting workplaces, they are fully a part of the COVID-19 monitoring unit. The head of that section would be the deputy director or deputy head of the monitoring unit. And they have been very, very active all over the place, making sure that people follow the guidelines. Now, in terms of hospitality in particular, I'm going to be careful how we speak because I might start getting too involved in the conversation at that level. But I just want to say that I agree with Jeffrey, and I think all of us know, tourism is very people focused, and a good tourism experience depends on people interacting on a personal level. So whereas you can have maybe reservations done remotely, you can have the front desk done remotely. You can have rooms prepared remotely. You can't have meals prepared and served remotely. So there is that understanding that there has to be a greater focus, because there are significant limits to what a tourism business can do as it relates to separating people. That said, we have made it quite clear, and this is we meaning government, not necessarily the Ministry of Labor, that owners and operators have a responsibility for the safety and health, and as the Shaw Act says, safety and health at work, safety, health, and welfare of their workers. Anecdotally, I can use that term as well. I think we've seen improvements, growth, learning in the understanding of what that means. I have to say, though, to be honest, that initially we saw a panic take hold of a lot of employers, including employers in the tourism sector, a panic response. And I think it is because we were really in unknown territory. Workers saw their jobs potentially disappearing. Employers and business owners also saw their businesses potentially disappearing. And there was a response, a reaction that was, in my view, born out of panic. I think we've come to some degree to get a grip on ourselves, and there is, in my view, a greater level of responsibility. Are we where we need to be? No. There's always going to be room for improvement, and the Ministry of Labor will always be pushing the tourism sector and every other sector to make sure that there does not develop any dichotomy between lives and livelihoods. We need both, and there can be both, but it means that those who are engaged, so employers and workers, have to recognize that safety is paramount. That is why when the Safety and Health at Work Act was implemented, employers can actually sanction workers for not following protocols. And so the understanding here is that there is a responsibility on the part of the employer to make sure that all the protocols are adhered to, that the health and safety and welfare of their workers as human beings is paramount.
Thank you. Well, we're going to return to tourism a bit later on in the program, but I just want to bring in Mrs. Moore at this point, because I've heard the employer's representative for tourism, the employer's representative as a whole, and the Minister of Labor say, well, last year, this was a novel situation. People panicked. It wasn't the prettiest situation. But they're now saying that we're seeing an improvement in the way that employers are treating to their employees. Is that the experience of the Barbados Workers Union? Can you concur? I'm not hearing you, Tone. Feel free to unmute your mic.
That has been the general experience. I thought I had mentioned that earlier. And I emphasize on general. There are always those people that will try a thing. But what I can say is that for 2021, so far during this period of lockdown, the experience has been far less negative than it was in 2020. We, however, have the challenge that we would not have had last year, where a number of employees early in this year are not entitled to unemployment benefits, because a large number of them would have exhausted unemployment benefit in 2020. And by and large, we have had cooperation from employers to see how they could treat to this situation to ensure that in most cases, layoff is being used as a last resort. No system is perfect, so there are some challenges that we encounter from time to time, but generally the experience has been much better than last year.
Okay. I just want to bring in our Sagicor executive before we go to the break. We've had much discussion about this new normal, what employers should do. But from your perspective as an HR practitioner, what should workers be doing at this point to prepare themselves to fit into this quote unquote new normal?
Thanks, Kareem. I think it's important for workers to reach out. The reality is the approach we took at Sagicor was we took front. We actually were the ones reaching out and saying, ahead of the first cases reaching Barbados, guys, do we have anybody who's vulnerable among us, who have any of the non-communicable diseases, et cetera, that are impacted? And they shared that information. What that allowed us to do is when the first cases were confirmed in Barbados, we got our pregnant people and our asthmatics out of the building as quickly as we could. And that was prior to any lockdown activity. So I would say that what workers or employees need to do is reach out to your people leaders, reach out to your HR departments. HR has shouldered a lot of the burden of COVID-19, and we're going to continue to do so. The other thing I want to make very clear for all employers is that the way you lead in a crisis will leave a lasting impression, not just on your people, but on your customers, because a lot of your customers are close to your people. It's going to leave a lasting impression on your community. And the other thing I want to say before you go to the break is that the internal community, our people, is our first community. And the actions we take within our businesses will have a direct impact on the national fight against COVID-19.
Thank you so much. That's a great point on which we can move into our next break. When we get back, we're going to continue our discussion on tourism just a bit more, and then we segue into discussions on mental health and the workplace. Stay tuned.
Advertise with us in COVID Weekly. For more information, email us at sales@barbadostoday.bb or contact us at 234-0046 or 234-1201 or 234-1210.
Yeah, so moving on smartly, I just want to take us back to the tourism industry again, and believe you me, I don't want to take us too much into the past, but I felt like if there were a number of things that happened last year that we can learn from going forward in relation to tourism, and then later on we saw it with the discussion regarding G4S workers and workers who are considered to be closer to the bottom of the pay scale in Barbados. Now, at that time, there were a number of workers crying out for severance, which in many cases we understand has been covered now with assistance from the NIS, as well as some other employers in the tourism sector who have come forward. But we also at that time heard a unanimous chorus of workers kind of crying out about their treatment in the sector, as if to some extent it is this type of subservient type of atmosphere. And I just wanted us to weigh in on this. Anybody can feel free to go first, but can we do more work? Is there space for more work to be done in the way that our tourism industry functions as it relates to workers and that relationship between workers and the employer? Because it was sparked by the way that they were treated in relation to severance and the lack of engagement from the employer. But while those discussions were going on, we were hearing a lot from workers that suggested a measure of frustration.
Kareem, given my position, I think I can jump in first. You used a term there that I really wouldn't use. You said unanimous from across the industry. I don't think it was unanimous. I mean, we did have some pockets of outcries, and as I think the minister said, in 2020 there was some panic, I think, on both sides of the fence, from some of the employers, from some of the employees. But I think that what I can say to that is that I think in just about all those situations, through dialogue between the BHTA, the Barbados Workers Union, the Ministry of Tourism, and the employers, as well as some of the employees themselves, we were able to settle the differences, because in many cases, what you would have found is that sometimes persons didn't totally understand what they were required to do. As Tony said, there are guidelines that persons are supposed to follow, And as I said, some people don't always get it right. So I think largely we resolved those. But the truth is that there are a large number of employees who didn't go out and cry out because their employers, as Tony said, were seeking to take care of them in some way wherever possible, right? But I think certainly going forward, there are always opportunities for improvement. I think that what we certainly have been encouraging our members to do is to engage with their staff a whole lot more. And I don't know if Tony's smiling right now, because I know there's something that she has said as well, that, from the perspective of the workers' union, that is something that sometimes their members will come to them with, that they're not hearing from their employers. And we've encouraged the employers at every opportunity to have conversations with your teams, talk to them, let them know what is going on, build that level of relationship where they're comfortable coming to you if there's an issue, right? And it's not to say that we want to come to you and not talk to the union, because, as I said, in every system, they have their checks and balances. And the BWU serves as a very viable check and balance within the system of labor relations. But I think going forward, certainly more dialogue. I think training is an area that we need to enhance. And interestingly enough, one of the things that is required under the BEST program is that every applicant to that program is required to submit a training plan for their employees that they are engaging as part of their application. Because we recognize, and as you said, the Minister of Tourism has indicated that there's going to be a session convened to talk about the reimagining of tourism and the resurgence of tourism in Barbados. And when we look at it, we need to do a number of things differently. So, for example, one is simple things, and I know that there are some employers, and not necessarily hotels, because quite often we talk about hotels because they're larger employers, but there are some members who have already started the process of having their teams trained in foreign languages, for example. If we're going to talk about attracting visitors from our non-traditional markets, the Spanish-speaking guests and French-speaking guests, it's important that we are able to converse with them in a way that puts them at ease. I always say that tourism is like, I invite you to my house. When I invite you to my house, it's not for you to make yourself comfortable. It's for me to make you comfortable. And as a tourism destination, the onus is on us to make sure that those persons who come to Barbados are comfortable. So the training aspect has to be critical going forward.
Understood. I want to bring in Mrs. Moore at this point. This discussion on tourism, I know there were many points at which there were some points at which the Barbados Workers Union was able to intervene, and there were other points where perhaps the membership was not there in terms of the hotels that were affected last year. But as a representative body for workers in Barbados, and outside of the COVID crisis, outside of the severance issues that we saw last year, do you think that there is room for improvement in the way tourism workers are treated?
There's always room for improvement. And that is something that we have been emphasizing with the BHTA every opportunity that we have had to meet, before COVID and since then, as recently as 2 weeks ago, when we had our last meeting. Tourism is our business. Let's play our part is something that I grew up hearing from a child. And it resonates better with me than the I am tourism, which now is the slogan. And if we are saying that tourism workers are so critical to what we do, and if we are recognizing that for this economy to pick back up, then it is going to hinge very largely on the fortunes of tourism. Then not only the employers in tourism must be made to feel important and must be put in a position where they can negotiate conditions that will favor how they participate or how they cooperate with programs, but the very workers who are going to make it happen. And when the Barbados Workers Union supported and in fact proposed since last year, June, the whole notion of a job retention program for tourism, our focus as the workers' representative was to ensure that long-standing employees, people who had given their all to tourism, many of them given every single working day of their lives to tourism, would not just be put in a position where they had to take a severance package that will see them getting between $10,000 and $20,000 if they were lucky to get so much. But that these workers could be positioned where they could learn more, where they could receive more training, where they could be in a position when tourism bumps back to offer more to their country as it relates to the service that they give to customers, to tourists when they come. And for us, we see that now we are at this point where tourism is slow, that if engagement isn't at its maximum now, and if we don't draw down from that, draw on that and make sure that we get the maximum response, then it does not augur well. You recognize that the Barbados Workers Union was not representing all of the workers in tourism where we were able to work through the critical issues for them. Where we weren't directly responsible because the establishments weren't membership of the BHTA, or the workers went off on their own, and some of them were non-members of the BW, and so we can speak for them directly. Behind the scenes, we were doing all that was possible, and we continue to do so. Right now, there are just 2 establishments that I'm aware of where we are working through details of severance, where workers are entitled, and we are ensuring that they get their due in the shortest possible time. But our obligation to workers, our foremost obligation, wasn't to get them severance, but to make sure that they can continue to benefit as contributors to our tourism product, and that they could continue to have an option that would not see them put on the breadline alongside so many thousands of others in Barbados. So in terms of improvement and collaboration, we have been working with the BHTA, we've been working with the Minister of Tourism, and we are not going to rest until the BHTA and the ministry more indirectly do its utmost to give tourism workers their due, as we continue to fight not only for tourism workers, but for other workers as well. And I'm very interested to weigh in on the minimum wage issue, therefore, when we get there.
I think, Kareem, before you go on, I'd like to add something to the conversation, and that's that employers, regardless of sector, need to go beyond severance. It's not just about the money you put in their hand and whether you pay in accordance with the law or you top it apart or whatever you do. You also need to look at how do you manage this transition for your people. These terminations are not happening because of performance issues. They're happening because of an external environment that's forcing it. It's a huge change. And even though we've been dealing with COVID for a long time, for many people, it's still an unexpected change. Nobody expects that call that says, sorry, I'm going to have to let you go. So as employers, how do we help people to manage that transition? Can we give them access to counseling above and beyond what we provided while they were employed with us? Because the relationship is severed or terminated does not mean that our obligation to see these people not as a number in headcount that has been reduced, but as a contributor in our country. That's important. The other thing that employers can do is think about how can we leverage the resources we have to help those people who are leaving us who have side hustles, for example. Do we have access to a graphic designer that can help them do a flyer for their business? Can we use our internal email systems to help them circulate their flyers and get them going? So these are some of the things I think we need to think about.
Thank you. And in the interest of time, I really want to go right back to Mrs. Moore. You raised the issue of the minimum wage. You said that you were eager to get into it. How satisfied are you with where those discussions have reached? We got a major update last week from the minister, but from your perspective, and I know much of these discussions were born out of the talks regarding G4S late last year. How satisfied are you with the progress that has been made in these 3 months?
Well, I'm eagerly looking forward to April 1, not because it's Awful's Day, but because it's the day that we expect the new minimum wage order to take effect. But with that said, I'm also concerned that, or guarded, to observe that it just notes a step toward where ultimately we should be headed, and that on April 1st, we will not be there as yet. The order speaks about $8.50 per hour becoming the new minimum, and that's where the public is commenting right now. And $8.50, while representing a significant increase to the employer's wage bill, is significantly below where a minimum should be. When we were looking at the SHOPS Act, on the last occasion we were looking at the SHOPS Act in 2008, indeed the $8.50 is below what the consideration should have been then. And I say that because when the basket of goods was looked at for sales assistance under the SHOPS Act during 2008, $340 a week was regarded as the wage that would allow people to buy the basics. But within that, it did not take account of entertainment. And within that, it looked at rent as $65 per week. $65 a week for rent. Like, where do you get that kind of accommodation in Barbados at this time? And it looked at utilities being $25 a week, and bus fares being $45 a week for 3 people. And bus fares would be more than $45 a week for a single person, especially if you have to catch 2 buses now. So at the time when $6.25 was recognized to be that wage, it was accepted at a time, or it was implemented, never accepted by the BW, and the record will show that, but it was implemented way below what would be a comfortable minimum for some person to live on. And there's the concept of the living wage versus the minimum wage. So I am eager to weigh in. It's because the Barbados Workers Union's view has been, and it continues up to this time, that because a wage might be uncomfortable for employers, we have to look at that wage in the context not of what it does to the employer only, but what it is intended to do to the worker. And for me, it is untenable, and it is almost unimaginable that companies would be ready to admit that their means of survival resides only within their capacity to suppress the wages of workers at this point to $6.25 in the name of COVID. And I would challenge those employers, and I would challenge anybody who's minded to take that view, to go to a supermarket and try to spend $260 a week for a family of 4. And one of the things that, and 4 is not an average, because I know in a canvas very recently across a constituency that 4 people isn't a normal family in Barbados, isn't the average family in Barbados. You're looking more at 7. And I would want to challenge people to try to figure out how you would spend $260 in a supermarket to feed 5 to 7 people. Furthermore, having to look at things like utilities and rent and so on. I've always maintained, and I've said it before on this issue, it is never the wrong time to do the right thing. I believe businesses have to figure out themselves and have to figure out how we are not going to stick up at $8.50 because the Barbados Workers Union isn't going to be about that. but how we can see how we can start there, and over the course of several years, get the minimum wage to something that will be more livable. Because if we don't do that, we are going to see too many people, more than necessary, ending up having to depend on social services.
I'm gonna throw it directly to Ms. Mears Granville. How do you respond?
I will respond by first stating, when we at the BEC canvassed our members on the issue of minimum wage, there was almost a universal response that the minimum wage needed to be revised. So from the employer's perspective, $6.25 is a very low wage. Let's be frank. However, we also have to face the reality that businesses in Barbados are struggling. And they've only not now started to struggle because of COVID. What I think many persons might not recognize is maybe from about 2010, 2012, up until 2018, the Barbados economy has grown at a very, very slow rate. Very slow. And even over that period, we saw many businesses struggling with the increased cost of doing business, which extends even beyond wages and salaries. We also know that the cost of labor in Barbados is high compared to pretty much everyone we compete with. Our cost of labor is high, and then we have a business community struggling with the cost of doing business, coupled with a very low economic growth over a number of years. And then they're hit with a pandemic. So somehow persons believe that all businesses have money. That is not the case. Businesses operate in the same environment within which we live. So there are some out there who are struggling for survival. The concern has been that some won't make it. And therefore, having the increase at this time was a concern. But as I said from the outset, there was the almost universal response that the minimum wage needed to be reviewed. The view of the business community has been that the last increase was, when was it, 2012, Tony? 2011, 2012, there was the last increase to the minimum wage. It has been too long. When you take 9 to 10 years to look at a minimum wage, you've created now a significant lag. If we had an approach that allowed for gradual increases, that is a preferred approach. But when you're looking at a 9-year period and then a situation that is unprecedented, unique, that has extreme economic pressure, businesses are going to be hard pressed.
Understood.
But the impact has not been, it is not something that businesses believe should not be looked at.
Okay. Tony, I'm going to have to give you about 30 seconds to respond, but we really need to get the minister weighing in on this. 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'm just saying that a business model has to be revisited, because businesses shouldn't be under pressure if businesses were concentrating, as Paula was saying earlier, on doing the right things by HR. By putting the right wage structures in place in the first.
Well, Tony, I know we only have a few seconds, so just remember
advantage of workers by paying them the very minimum, and they can't even live on it.
Well, Tony, just remember my response had two components.
Yeah.
We also looked at the cost of doing business. So what we're saying is that is something that needs to be addressed as well.
The diplomatic way to respond to those businesses that can only survive if they pay $6.25. I haven't figured that out yet, but I'll work it out before the end of the program.
You only have about 30 seconds to do those calculations, but I'll take it to the minister now. We're hearing on one hand, businesses are saying that $8.50 going forward will not be enough. It's not a living wage. On the other hand, we understand that there is a tight squeeze as far as businesses are concerned as well. How do we strike the balance?
We strike the balance by recognizing that we have to start somewhere. And so 625, everybody who the minimum wage board has spoken to, the Blue Ribbon Advisory Committee has spoken to, everybody understands that 625 is untenable. That is a poverty wage. You're working, a person is working and is in poverty, not just poor, but in poverty. So we start from that perspective. We also know that we cannot go from 0 to 100 just like that. So we are cognizant of the fact that we are in a pandemic, and the pandemic is real. Even for those who did not think it was real, some of them eventually became ill as well. I'm not talking about in Barbados. But the pandemic is real. And businesses, employers, because remember that all employers aren't businesses, they're employers as well in the third sector. And unions also employ. So employers have challenges. All of that said, we recognize that coming out of the pandemic, the focus must be on people. I've had the fortune of being both, being on the side of employers when in my previous incarnation, if I may use that term. And I am aware, I've also been a small employer at one point as well. There's never going to be a good time to increase any kind of cost for a business. There's never going to be a good time. So a pandemic may be a challenging time, but pandemic or no pandemic, there's not going to be a good time. What I'll say though, is that there are quite a number of positives that will come out of an increase in the minimum wage. I want to, before I speak to the positive though, to say that those at the minimum, that number does not represent all of the workers in most establishments. It does not reflect the total workforce in most establishments. So it is not to say that that increase from 625 to 850 will impact the bottom line in a straight mathematical calculation. That is to say, well, 36% is the increase, 850, the 225 on 625. It is not to say that your wage bill for the average business will increase by 36%, because there's always a hierarchy of earning in business organizations, in employing organizations generally. So we are talking only about those persons who are right now below the proposed increase. Remember that we have made a proposal, it is public. We are in the 40-day period where persons can object. The minimum wage board will look at those objections, and then we'll make a final recommendation to the cabinet of the country. At this point, that 625 to the proposed 850 does not cover everybody. That said, the positives coming out of the increase in the minimum wage speak first to allowing those who are affected by it, and I'm referring specifically to workers, it allows them to be able to either breathe a little more easily or breathe a little less, with a little less difficulty. Because as Tony said earlier, 850 will not take the pressure off of everybody. It definitely will not. And we understand that, but we've always said that a government has to balance competing interests. That is what a government has to do. And we want, as a first step, to allow people to breathe a little easier or with some less difficulty. But what I want to say is that many of the businesses that are going to be initially impacted by the increase in the minimum wage should also recognize that persons who earn at that level have what economists refer to as a high propensity to spend. That money is not going to be used for savings. That additional money is going directly back into the economy. Where is that money spent? Not with government. That money is going to be spent with many of those businesses that have the increase in the payroll. So I want businesses to recognize that the money is going to be spent in clearing bills for utilities. It's going to be spent in paying rents to our rent arrears. A lot of it is going to be spent in supermarkets, in shops, in mini marts. The money is going to be spent so that there is going to be that economic stimulus, so to speak, which will benefit almost all businesses across the board. And I want us to look at it from that perspective. It helps people to breathe a little bit more easily or with less difficulty, but it also will benefit almost immediately businesses that have had to pay a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Minister. We are essentially out of time. I think this is a great place for us to wrap up. We've been discussing issues related to labor and employment issues, perhaps that have been around, that have plagued us for decades, but that have been brought sharply into focus by the COVID-19 pandemic. To wrap up, I just want to ask all of our panelists in 30 seconds to present their outlook for the future of this symbiotic relationship. We'll start with Ms. Walcott.
I think the future is bright. At the end of the day, what COVID-19 has forced us to do as a people is to get closer together. And there's strength in that. There's real power there. I would say to leaders, don't waste this crisis. Double down, connect with your people, and remember that how your business behaves on the inside is going to show up on the outside. And your customers are going to be remember what you've done.
Unmute, please.
Sorry. Right. I'm saying that in summary, I think what COVID-19 has done is given us an opportunity to forge stronger relationships. When we talk about labor relations, that is not the domain of any single agency. It's not the domain of the Ministry of Labor alone, the union, the employers. It is dependent on all of us working together to overcome and improve the labor scenario in the island. So I think certainly what has started to emerge and hopefully what we can build on is the level of engagement that we've seen in the last, I'd say almost a year to try to get us to where we are at this stage.
I would say that, okay.
I would say that coming out of the COVID-19 situation, what I want to encourage businesses to do is to not go backward, to not be in a hurry to go back to what you knew in the past and thought was comfortable. Embrace the changes that are coming on board, which will include increased dialogue with your staff, new forms of working, and look toward the future. Look to the changing way of doing business and the changing way of interacting with your staff so that you can have a more engaged team, which will propel you in the new era that will emerge at the end of COVID.
Mrs. Moore.
I think our experience for the last year has shown that there is no real, it's difficult to find the silver lining behind the cloud called COVID-19. But yet, as our discussion has unveiled, potential opportunities emerge for that to happen. And I think that building the future we want will require a whole of society approach. We need to work together to find the right policy mix that is needed now more than ever. We need to be able to balance the social with the economic with the environment, and we need to invest in our people first and foremost. If we keep our people at the front of our mind, then all of the other things, a lot of the other things that we discuss here this evening will fall into place as we build towards a more inclusive society. That should be our objective.
And our minister with a bird's eye view.
Thanks very much, Kareem, and thanks for the opportunity to have shared the platform with the other panelists this evening. We have been in and continue to be in a very difficult situation, but like life in general, we will get past this. We have learned many lessons, and I just want to maybe make a couple of comments. One is that workers are people. And I say that not simply to state the obvious, but to say to all of us that when we are addressing matters that speak to workers, we have to recognize that they are human beings. Like I said before, not pieces of machinery, not equipment, people with emotions, feelings, fears. The power dynamic between employers and workers is not equal, and so there's a greater responsibility on the part of employers. The second thing I want to say is that when we came into office in 2018, we have been speaking to the matter of shared burden. In this pandemic, there is a lot of burden, a lot of loss, but it has to be shared. One group cannot just pack up and run. We have to be in this together because we are going to come out at the end of it. We have learned a lot of lessons. I don't want us to lose the lessons learned in this pandemic period. Too many people have suffered. Too many people have died for us to lose the lessons. A critical lesson in this pandemic, or coming out of the pandemic, is a matter of engagement. We have to talk. And just like we do it at the level of government and our social partners, it has to happen at the firm level, at the organization level. There has to be the engagement. Engaging with workers is not the purview of the HR manager. It is the purview of everybody in the leadership of every organization. And I want to say that particularly to those who manage and control and own employing organizations. It is not something you delegate. It is part of your responsibility. So to wrap it up, I'll just say that we have learned many lessons. I think we have made significant progress. Let us remember that we are building for a future. There's been lots of developments during this period, particularly technological. Let us build on it, because at the end of this pandemic, we ought to be in a better position than when we started.
Thank you, Minister. Indeed, the current situation may seem gloomy, but the future depends on our ability, to a large extent, our ability to adapt. From our team here at Barbados today, I want to thank each of the panelists for joining us and our viewers for this edition of BT Pulse. Good night.
Advertise with us in COVID Weekly. For more information, email us at sales@barbadostoday.bb or contact us at 234-0046 or 234-1201 or 234-1210.